Welcome to episode 24 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today we have a special episode because we have a very special guest today, Drake Eserhaut, who has been a part of the DDS team for a while now, but we are kind of more officially bringing him on as a coach for one-on-one coaching clients as well. And just to kind of give you guys a bit of background here, we've known Drake for a while. I've personally been working with Drake in a one-on-one setting. I've been his coach for I think 2 years now, or a little bit over 2 years. So we've known Drake for a while. He's also been a huge part of our individualized programming product. So he's been a cornerstone in terms of development of that, as well as the recent improvements we've made as well. So he's been a huge part of our team. We're excited to get him on the podcast, let you guys learn a little bit more about him. And then the next part of this discussion is we're going to be talking about fatigue and kind of what it is, and kind of go into some practical applications of these concepts. And that leads me to my next point, in that when Zach and I are thinking, whether we want to bring a certain individual onto the team and work with someone, it's of course, do we feel that they can do as good, or if not better job than Zach and I can when working with our typical clientele? Drake absolutely checks that box for us. Secondly, do they kind of bring something to the table that is beyond Zach and I's capabilities in a certain area, right? And for Drake, that's kind of this side of athlete monitoring, training fatigue, etc., which you guys will hear about more in a little bit. So that's a little bit of background. So we're stoked to have Drake on board. So yeah, that's kind of all I will kind of open with. Drake, I will kick it over to you. Go ahead, introduce yourself, give a little introduction and background about where you're at now in terms of your career, how you got into all this stuff, and just kind of whatever you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Josh. As always, pleasure to chat with you fellows. My background is in, just like Josh said, in athlete monitoring. I got my undergrad and my master's at the University of Northern Iowa, which is in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And during that time, I had the opportunity to serve a sort of like dual assistantship position where I served on the strength and conditioning crew at UNI, while also assisting a guy by the name of Dr. Jacob Reed with some sports science related athlete monitoring stuff. And so that's sort of where I cut my teeth on coaching, specifically in student athletes, as well as with collecting data in the field, and then also being tasked with aggregating that data, making sense of it, creating dashboards, all that neat stuff. So that was undergrad and masters, and now I'm currently at the University of Kansas down here in Lawrence, pursuing my PhD in exercise physiology under Dr. Andy Fry. And we're currently in the process of diving a little deeper into a variety of athlete monitoring related contexts or concepts, but also overtraining syndromes specific to strength sport, how we can potentially better define those terms or improve diagnostic clarity there, as well as some other things related to our athletic performance lab here. So working with student athletes and coaching staff here at KU.
Sweet. I think that's an awesome kind of intro and background, Drake, as always. I guess one of the first questions I have for you, just based on that, is obviously the kind of target population that we work with primarily, like you mentioned, is kind of athletes that are invested in strength sports, whether that's powerlifters, people that have hypertrophy oriented goals. But I think based on my experience, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, working with more of like a general sporting population comes with its own challenges. And I'd be curious to kind of hear some post reflections on how has strength conditioning and that experience kind of maybe helped frame the way that you approach strength sports, and maybe vice versa. I'm just kind of curious how that has kind of shaped the way that you look at things, because obviously you're dealing with so many more variables when you're working with, dare I say, real athletes. You have school, you have the actual sport specific practice, probably some sort of conditioning that is not 5 reps on the squat. in addition to the work you're going to do in the weight room. So just a lot more variables you have to manage. And I think from an athlete modeling perspective, that's going to give you, a very different challenge than maybe some more of the simplified demands that we have in strength sport that we often probably take for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. So working with student athletes, just like you said, Zach, like brings a whole host of different challenges related to like their demands, and their day-to-day schedules are so varied usually. They have a lot on their plate. So from the monitoring side of things, having my eyes open to just like all the, not even necessarily just the training demands, but also the non-training demands of those individuals, and how those may influence their performance on any given day, and how that may influence just like their perception of training or perception of sport from an exertion standpoint. Um, it really put an emphasis on like their coping strategies for just psychological and social stress and things like that. So translating that experience from S&C, just knowing what student athletes go through and all the different things that factor into their performance and what they have to deal with, translating that to the strength athlete, where again, like cardio, maybe like any set, 5 reps or more, um, could be perceived as a pretty, stressful endeavor. But uh, conceptualizing like all the different things that we have to go through, just, depending upon what the individual has on their plate from a work standpoint, a family standpoint, things like that, those factors can still, be at play when it comes to trying to gauge whether or not they're in a state where they're ready to go in and hit the gym X amount of days a week. Are they in a psychologically positive state? How do those different variables factor in? So I think having that experience in S&C, where again, there's so many different things that you need to account for, really helped me translate that to, again, the strength athlete, where they have potentially a more fixed schedule for the average individual, but being aware of all the different non-training stressors that could still be very relevant to an individual that's not a student athlete.
Awesome, man. I definitely don't have nearly the degree of experience that you do with team sport athletes, but I know that moving from working with team sport athletes to like more like strength athletes, or kind of our typical clientele, that's somebody that um, prioritizes strength and or hypertrophy outcomes. It's a lot more. There's a it's a lot smaller window that you're kind of working with, if you will. Um, so I think if you're able to have some degree of useful monitoring in the context of a team sport athlete, it almost is like it's almost like putting the ball in a tee when you're working with kind of the gym goer that cares about strength and hypertrophy. Not to minimize their goals, right? They're athletes just as much as a team sport athlete is, but kind of just the overall context is a lot more constrained, if you will, which I think makes it easier to potentially like make decisions based off of that stuff, or at least start conversations, right? And just to kind of plug some of the stuff that Drake has done for us, he helped kind of take what we had um, in terms of our like data analysis in our spreadsheet systems, and turn that into a much more robust kind of athlete monitoring system. So when I get a check-in from a client, I can pop over to one of the tabs in our spreadsheet and see a kind of a red, yellow, green stoplight system in terms of athlete monitoring for all these different factors, right? And it's not an algorithmic type thing of, okay, their upper body soreness is in the red, or their sleep is in the red, so thus I make X change, but rather it's a conversation starter, right? So having that kind of um, objective, thing to look at in order to kind of lead us to some of the subjective, discussions, or seek subjective input in addition to that, has been huge for me, right? Just like on a day-to-day workflow basis, as well as I notice it all the time, improving my decision making, or at least improving when I should reach out to somebody and get a little bit more context, right? I think as we know, working one-on-one with people, some people will be very quick to tell you when they have something going on, other people not so much. So kind of having something like that as a conversation starter has been huge. So anyway, off of that, I just wanted to ask you, Drake, with when you are working with someone one-on-one, or just in general, where do you think athlete monitoring what is the role of athlete monitoring in your eyes, right? If you kind of just take your understanding of the literature, your experience with team sport athletes, your experience with more strength focused athletes as well, where does athlete monitoring fit into this picture in addition to kind of what I discussed?
Yeah. So when working with athletes one on one, especially strength athletes, I think athlete monitoring really fits in well within the context of just like helping facilitate our conversations. So I always say, like, first and foremost, your best tool for athlete monitoring is coach athlete discussions, which is a little redundant, right? Like, of course, the coach is going to talk to their athlete, and you obviously should, but it just helps facilitate those conversations and maybe help direct where those conversations start out at, right? So just like you said, Josh, with like our dashboard systems or whatnot, if you notice that an athlete's sleep quality is significantly poor, or it flags as red on our back end for multiple weeks in a row, like 2 or 3, then we'll be like, reach out, be like, hey, what's going on? Like, is there anything that we need to account for here? Is your pre-bedtime routine significantly abnormal? You got a lot of stuff on your plate, things like that. It can just help spark our discussions and then lead us down a path towards improving those habitual things like pre-bedtime routine, or if it's a nutritional factor, it could steer us in that direction. It just helps facilitate conversation, and I think that's where it really fits in well, right? It gives us some additional context. It gives athletes an opportunity to fill you in on some areas that maybe don't get hit on our week-to-week check-ins, when you're like, hey man, I saw like your bench E1RM is up. That's freaking awesome. But squat and deadlift, or maybe maintaining or whatnot, and you have a conversation about training. Now you can also spark a discussion about the non-training factors.
Right on, man. I think that makes a ton of sense, and I guess I wanted to kind of cover that because it might be, oh, data driven strength podcast, athlete monitoring guy, X goes in, Y comes out every single time. Like, for example, you helped us develop kind of our progress categorization system with our individualized programming product. And we use objective thresholds in order to kind of categorize whether, hey, your squat progress was satisfactory or unsatisfactory over this training cycle, right? We'll kind of use strength levels and your rate of progress to kind of categorize that. But importantly, we always leave room for subjective interpretation on the athlete's end in terms of whether that was indeed satisfactory progress, right? It's not, you know, you need all the context in order to actually pinpoint whether that was satisfactory or unsatisfactory progress. So I just wanted to really underscore that point that, like, numbers are helpful. They get you a starting point. They maybe direct those conversations, but they're never going to be the end all be all. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to emphasize that. Zach, I'll kick it
Yeah,
over to you.
yeah. Quickly off that, Drake. I mean, just to kind of carry that conversation a bit further, I think um, it's easy to kind of get lost in some of this stuff and get really excited about all these metrics that we can track, how it is going to influence our conversations and all that stuff. As somebody who, we've had multiple conversations about, how far we've come with spreadsheets and all this stuff. As somebody who's made a lot of mistakes myself, where do you think the biggest errors coaches make when embarking on, okay, hey, I want to improve some of my athlete monitoring practices. I want to start tracking some of the subjective information to inform our conversations. What do you think the kind of the biggest pitfalls coaches make are?
And Drake, if you don't have an answer off the bat, we can tell you all Zach and I can tell you all the
Yeah, I was
things
gonna
we
say.
screwed up.
Right,
No,
I
no,
was gonna
no.
say.
I've got some examples. Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat as you, Zach, and I think you're kind of teeing this up for me here, where like initially in my spreadsheets for one-on-one clients and even athlete monitoring, I would track everything I could, right? Everything I could. I would track, you know, as many variables as possible, whether or not they directly influence my decision making, right? Like, even if I didn't factor them into my decision making, I would want to track as many things, right? I would want my spreadsheet to go from A to ZZ, right, in the column section. So I think that's a pretty major pitfall, where initially it can be enticing to track as many variables as possible with the hopes that they will directly influence your decision making, but honing it down to a handful of subjective things, right, with our wellness questionnaires and things like that, or maybe up to 10, whatever you deem most valuable to you and your athletes, as long as you check some major boxes and you consistently refer to these variables, then include those, right? Um, so I think that's a pretty major pitfall where it can be enticing to track as many things as possible. Make sure that you're asking the questions and getting the data that you use on a regular basis, right? When you open that spreadsheet on a weekly basis to post the next week of training for the athlete, make sure that you're actually referring to like those 8 metrics that you want to track, and just check in to see if they're in line or if they're abnormal, things like that.
I
But
think
you
that
guys, yeah, you guys have any like examples of some things you've done in the past?
well, just real quick, I just want to give you some props because like that's the thing to me that has been kind of the most impressive to the modifications you've made to a lot of our processes on the back end. Like I said, I've been creating absurdly complex spreadsheets to the point that they don't even work, with so many if statements and stuff. And you know exactly how that works, Drake, with like every metric under the sun. Like you're putting all this stuff into the input box, and it doesn't always influence your decision making, like you said. But the way that you have made the back end stuff that we have now extremely complex, extremely detailed, but it's super duper efficient. Like that's the thing, is like we only take what we need. But like Josh said, like I don't think it can be overstated how cool those progress thresholds are. Like I think that's something that's really, really cool and novel, and I haven't seen that really anywhere else. But like you said, we take a very select amount of metrics, but get the most we possibly can out of those. And I just think that's a really cool thing you've done, and really opened my eyes to how that can be done in strength sports. And I think just your overall experience with juggling all these variables from team sports really is highlighted in your ability to kind of encapsulate all that information to a very efficient kind of snapshot for a coach to be able to actually influence what they're doing.
One thing to kind of add on to that is, Drake, as you've changed some of our processes, like you've I like how you've started with what's been verified, sorry, that's the wrong word, validated in the literature as being like, hey, this is a valid and reliable way to kind of detect XYZ thing, right? But then we've kind of worked backwards from there in applying it to the specific population that we work with. So, like for example, when you adjusted kind of our check-in processes for the athlete monitoring stuff, um, I just like, hey, dude, like, can we add this in? And you were able to integrate it, right? So you were able to use the research and use what's been validated, but then say, okay, we're consciously making this compromise in terms of what's been technically validated, and working backwards from there. So I think that's huge as well. And I would just echo what Zach said, like, um, when I think about kind of the dashboard that I'm able to look at when an athlete completes a check-in, basically everything on there I use on a regular basis. Like it's so simple, but the average session RPE trend, for example, is something that we didn't have before, I don't think. But I'll always like that has been extremely helpful for me in specific scenarios because, like, for example, I can see how, okay, I know that this block and this block on paper should be similar, training stress from an absolute perspective, but from a relative perspective, based on these session RP scores, something's a little bit off here. So that's a conversation starter, or that's more insight into something else I might be noticing. So like there's a lot there, but it's also like really intuitive and makes a lot of sense, and it's actually helpful in terms of decision making. And I think that's what we need to always continue to strive to do. So anyway, I was just kind of agreeing with Zach, and adding an additional example, but yeah, Drake, I don't know if you have anything to hop in there. If not, we can move on to the main discussion of today.
Yeah, just a quick thing before we hop into the whole like fatigue discussion here. Just so the listeners kind of have an idea. Josh was talking about like using the validated questionnaires in the literature, kind of what that shows us, and then riffing on that or modifying that a little bit to fit our needs and our context, just so that people have an idea. Like a lot of the athlete wellness questionnaires that are in the literature are very long. They're like 30 questions or more, and they recommend that you fill them out on a day-to-day basis, which we can imagine like having a strength athlete or someone, even a student athlete, where it may be more applicable, do that day to day. That's probably not the best route, just because that's a big time commitment, right? It's going to be a little inconvenient for them. So we've sort of like taken the concepts there and the big hitter variables to track, modify that to fit our needs, even though it may not be 100% quote unquote uh, valid in the literature. It's based upon validated metrics, and we've taken the big hitter variables and used those in our practice.
Perfect. I think that just kind of, speaks to everybody on this call's approach to using the research, right? Like if somebody's doing 8 sets per week, you might say it's not validated, right? Because it's not in that evidence-based 10 to 20 set per week range, but you're using the concept right. So yeah, man, I think that's great. Anyway, we will jump into the kind of main thing we wanted to talk about today. And this is kind of stuff in Drake's wheelhouse. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, this is stuff that Drake's going to be able to speak to way better than Zach and I can. So I know that I'll definitely be a fly on the wall to some degree here. But I will kick it over to you, Drake, to kind of talk about fatigue, right? What is it? It's kind of this hand wavy thing that a lot of people talk about, but not a lot of people can put their finger on. I don't know if anybody can kind of put their finger on it, right? Because there is still a lot of unknowns, which I'm sure you'll kind of talk about. But I'll just kick it over to you and let you riff on wherever you want to start in terms of fatigue and its relation to resistance training.
Yeah, absolutely. So fatigue, it's a hot topic. We talk about it a lot, especially as coaches, right? The notion that fatigue sort of accumulates throughout a training block or a training cycle is something that gets brought up a lot in discussion. And typically, just to, I guess, to kick us off here is like one big thing with fatigue is just figuring out a way to define it, right? Like, what's our working definition of fatigue? And at the simplest level, sort of in the literature, it's just a decrease in force production capacity. So, like an individual athlete's ability to produce force. So within the powerlifting context, right? Like your capacity to express force against the barbell on a back squat, that capacity is hindered via some mechanism or mechanisms, right? There's probably multiple. So that's sort of the working definition, very simplistic. More or less, your ability to perform at your baseline level is hindered via some underpinning mechanisms, right? Some other factors. Traditionally, this is broken up into like peripheral and central sort of categories. So, peripheral is more of your physiological changes. So, we think of like we do some pretty high repetition work. Maybe we do like a really good example would be like myo reps, where you get a pretty big pump going. We get a lot of metabolites accumulated within the muscle. This would be like your peripheral fatigue setting in, right? We get hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphates, all these fancy metabolites there, and these in essence hinder the muscle's ability to contract, right? It's acute. That pump will fade, right? After you leave the gym an hour later or whatnot, that pump goes away, and it's sort of it's gone, right? That's one way to conceptualize peripheral fatigue in some capacity. Um, Central fatigue, on the other hand, is one area that I know the three of us have chatted about, Zach and I especially, where it's very, very nuanced, right? There's a lot of things that go into central fatigue. So central fatigue is things along the lines of like some cognitive or like psychological hindrance where you cannot excite the muscles to the same degree as you could before, right? So there's something going on in the brain, the spinal cord, that central nervous system. And like I said, sometimes we look at this as the ability to contract the musculature and elicit an action potential, but the mechanism as to why the central fatigue may be hindered is very, again, very nuanced. It could be related to training related factors, but it could also be related to non-training factors as well. So things like cognitive stress, mental stress, things like that could potentially also be related to a diminished ability to contract the musculature. So, with that, just kind of a brief overview, I guess. Do you guys have any ways that you want to riff on that?
I want to jump in on central fatigue and just mention. I'll try to remember to throw it in the show notes. I think probably definitely top three. Top three reads in 2021 is there's a review paper that um, goes in and kind of questions some of the underlying presuppositions to how we currently investigate central fatigue, and basically that just adds additional confounders to how we are able to actually assess whether this happens, to what degree it does, if it in fact does. A very basic example is like, so the way that central fatigue is generally examined is we're looking at, like you said, Drake, you let's say you're doing a knee extension, you're producing as much force into a dynamometer as possible. They note that amount of force, and then they electrically evoke additional force production from a nerve. You're basically looking at how much force capacity is left there when you electrically evoke that contraction. One of the things that this review paper kind of talks about is like these things called psychic effects, is what they kind of labeled it as, meaning you are assuming that that maximal voluntary contraction is in fact maximal effort. And there are, as we've talked about ad nauseum, especially in Josh's recent article, there's so many things that go into the perception of effort, your ability to apply effort. So that within itself is an assumption that may or may not be totally justified. So I think it's just a super, super interesting topic. And you did a great job summarizing fatigue in general, Drake, and kind of giving us a jumping off point here. And I think the mechanisms are something definitely we're going to learn a ton about. But I just wanted to mention that quickly and just say, yeah, man, we got a lot to learn, especially in the context of kind of what we actually care about in training. But Josh, I don't know, got any thoughts on that before we get rolling here?
Yeah, I have two quick thoughts. So the first is that if okay, so the first one, and Drake, I'll definitely want you to follow up on this, because I think it's important to clarify for the listener of like, just maybe chat a little bit more about kind of that the difference in terms of conceptualizing fatigue in the acute sense, whether that's peripheral or central, and also like in the following days, right? We'll talk about fatigue accumulation in a little bit, but I think it's just important to really drill home that difference there. Um, just because that's probably what we care about as strength coaches and as strength athletes. We care about like, what is this phenomenon that is fatigue, because after my training session on Tuesday, I come in on Wednesday, or I come in and I hit that muscle group again on Thursday or Friday or whatever, right? Like, just kind of maybe just clarifying the difference in terms of what we mean by fatigue on that time course. Um, and then the next thing I want to point out is that, like, if we were to just go based on kind of the research we have right now in terms of the fatigue literature, like, okay, we have individuals go through two different protocols in a randomized order, right? One protocol is a certain training prescription. Another protocol is another training prescription. Just based on those study designs, in which you kind of have them come in whatever 24 48 hours later, look at force production capacity, you would only have people train with super heavy loads, right? Because basically those studies across the board find that higher rep training, like high rep, lower load training, is way more fatiguing across the board from a force output decrement perspective in the following days. However, just anecdotally, like, if you were to try to give everybody all their volume with 85 to 95%, they're just going to get crushed, right? And there's just something in the literature that I don't want to say it hasn't been accounted for, but there's kind of that mismatch in terms of practical experience and the current literature. So those are two separate thoughts. But Drake, I'll kick it over to you and kind of see what you have to say.
Yeah, so absolutely. I'll because it's fresh in my mind, I'll kind of riff on that last example there where in one instance we would have a relatively high repetition resistance training crew as opposed to a higher intensity crew, and we would assess fatigue responses 24 or 48 hours post, things like that. And it does a good job of highlighting potentially the differences between these peripheral and central mechanisms, maybe, or that's kind of our thought, right? Where to further explain the peripheral things and in the acute sense what fatigue may predominantly be is in the short term it could potentially be more of these physiological factors, right? So we think of like DOMS. For anyone that's come back, they have some muscle soreness as they return to a workload that they may not necessarily be accustomed to right away. Like that DOMS will be present for sure, but it's probably going to diminish, in the coming weeks. That's a pretty safe bet. So that wouldn't necessarily be like a chronic thing. That would be a decent example of acute fatigue. And to reel it back even further from the 1 to 2 week example to just like, 1 to 2 days after, we talked about sort of like metabolite accumulation, things like that. In the acute sense, those things typically they occur, right? They hinder our performance within that session, potentially within even a given exercise within the sets that are to come. But those things do fade in a relatively short amount of time, where those metabolites don't kind of stay around. At least that's our assumption. There are some things related to like calcium exposure at the muscle that could play into muscle damage accumulation. Well, not accumulation, but muscle damage occurring and things like that. So in the acute sense, we're kind of trying to space out training, Josh, like you said, where maybe we train quads Monday and we split up training in a way where that individual trains quads again on Wednesday and Friday. Maybe they squat 3 days a week. That would probably be arrived upon based upon what they can tolerate. And that would also tie into whether or not they feel like on Wednesday they can come in feeling like relatively fresh, not super beat down, right? You may not go into that session feeling like at the top of your game, and that may not be what we're going for. But as long as you're not like crushed from that Monday session, then that's sort of like in the acute sense, we want to make sure that we space things out so that you're not feeling the negative effects of these short term peripheral fatigue related factors. I don't know if that totally covered both of those thoughts that you proposed, but hopefully that did like a decent job.
Yeah, man. I don't know what's going on with your physiology, but you mentioned that those metabolites accumulate. You get the pump, but then the pump fades, right? I don't think Drake's pump fades. For anybody that knows Drake, he's wearing a data driven strength t-shirt right now. He definitely fills it out. So Drake's an exception to the rule here. I think the next place to go with this discussion is to talk about a longer time course. So we've kind of talked about that acute phase of training where you kind of have these mechanisms causing you to be fatigued within the session. Then we have some of this stuff that might impact force production as you defined fatigue in the following days or week, if you will. Then the next question is trying to explain this phenomenon of fatigue accumulation, right? So I'm on week 5 of my training block and I just feel a little bit beat up, for example. Um, a lot of people kind of say, hey, this is fatigue accumulation going on here. I'm just curious what your thought process is in terms of conceptualizing that phenomenon. Maybe people are missing the mark here. Just, kind of curious your general thoughts on that concept.
Yeah. So the way that like to conceptualize fatigue throughout or over the course of a training block is one. So again, my background is sort of, in athlete monitoring and trying to define when overreaching or overtraining may occur. And I like to conceptualize it as like spending a prolonged period of time in a state where your performance is decreased or diminishing. So across the block, obviously that would not be ideal, right? If we're seeing squat, bench, deadlift, E1RM trends go down, not just 1 week, but 2 weeks, 3 weeks, etc., or they decrease and they sort of plateau at a negative state relative to whatever an athlete's sort of baseline level of strength is, that could potentially be a sign that some mechanism related to fatigue is present and it's impacting the athlete to a degree that may not be ideal. Um, so when I try to conceptualize it from a slightly more chronic standpoint, again, in the context of a block, I think of it more so as a sustained state of abnormal fatigue. So we'll kind of dive into this in a little bit. We talked about the physiological factors, potentially the peripheral things, metabolites, muscle damage, all this stuff. But there's also some models of fatigue that frame it within the context of the biopsychosocial model. So anyone that's up on their pain science is pretty familiar with that structure. And there's also a similar model for fatigue. So there is some overlap there. They're not the exact same thing, but there is some crossover. And biopsychosocial. So there are some things related to the cognitive state of the athlete and maybe their social environment that could relate to their perception of fatigue or some expression of fatigue. So that's where making sure that they're on top of their game at work, right? Their time management skills are good, their sleep habits are good, they're in a positive social environment, things like that, that could aid their capacity to tolerate training and avoid dipping into that sustained state of performance decrement and things like that. So that's sort of how I try to conceptualize it, the physiological things are definitely at play, but also look at the psycho and social aspects as well, and whether or not those are related to their sustained decrease in performance.
So
Yeah.
if we view it that way, Drake, one question I have is like, how do you think that impacts from a practical perspective how we view autoregulation? So if we're ultimately, you're viewing it more so as this extended exposure to being in a fatigue state, how do you think that impacts, kind of the way that we view auto regulation, overshooting? How important is it to nail your RPs, that kind of thing? If this linear increase in fatigue maybe isn't the way that we frame it, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. So there's not like I won't have a clear cut answer here, right? There's going to be some nuances we can all relate to, but the like contradicting the notion that fatigue sort of accumulates linearly in a manner where, at week 6 of your block, it's going to be at its apex, um, is, I'm not saying that's not the way to look at it. It could still be a valid thing to consider, but in terms of auto regulation, yeah, overshooting your RPEs and things along those lines, could that have a short-term acute negative effect on your training? Potentially, right? Going into that example of Monday squats, Wednesday squats, could that hinder your Wednesday performance if you overshoot your single at 8, you hit a 9 or maybe an RPE 10 grinder on accident? Uh, maybe, um, but I would also conceptualize it within the context of like not beating yourself up too much about it psychologically, I guess, and framing it in a way where you just sort of rally the troops and get back after it Wednesday, and you hit whatever you got to hit on Wednesday, right? If you have a pause squat single on Wednesday at RPE 6 to 7 range, just go in there, do your best to hit that RPE. If you see a performance improvement, sweet. If not, take it for what it is and move on. So um, minimizing like the negative cognitive and mood states that may come with overshooting would probably how I would approach it. Um, yeah,
That's
but
it.
you guys have any thoughts
That's
about?
exactly what I was kind of. I was gonna ramble afterwards, depending on what you said, but that's the thing that came to mind to me because the thing with accumulated fatigue that's always kind of been an expectation violation for me is the fact that very regularly people hit PRs in the point of the block where they're supposed to be the most fatigued. Like that's a very frequent experience, not only in my own training but with the people that I coach as well. And I think this is anecdote land here now. This is not science. I think that is very much my experience to what I would attribute that to. It's not necessarily, you know, overshooting isn't ideal, obviously. Like that's going to be increased to some degree of the training stress. But I think what is a large contributor to kind of that prolonged, man, I'm just not feeling myself in the gym are these spikes in emotional state that come along with some of the things we experience in training. So I think the cliche of like taking every day as it comes and treating it all as like an independent event, I think is very very true. And from a practical perspective, I think that's kind of something we can draw from the understanding that there's a lot more inputs to fatigue here than just the training stimulus itself. So that's very much my experience, Drake, and that's kind of what I was going for there, even though the question may not have directly targeted it. I probably could ask it in a little bit better of a way, but yet that's the first thing that came to mind to me too, is essentially the emotional and psychological response you have to these, fatiguing tasks or whatever it may be. Josh, I don't know, you got anything on there?
Drake, do you have anything to say in direct response to that? Because I'm gonna kind of I have a kind of separate idea.
Nah, go for it, man.
Cool. So basically the way and again you were clear that we don't know this stuff for sure and this is all subject to change, right? But you're kind of conceptualizing the phenomenon that people generally seem to feel a little bit more fatigued at the end of their training blocks than maybe at the beginning, and that's probably more so due to the time course as opposed to like just this pile of fatigue that you're under, right? You're like the fatigue dragon just gets bigger and bigger throughout the training block. So but more so what you're saying is, hey, it's just because it's been like 5 or 6 weeks, man. You've been in this fatigued state due to the training stress, thus this is kind of necessitating a reduced period of training stress. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I would say that's a really solid way to frame it.
Okay,
Um,
cool.
yeah,
So
yep,
I think I think that's really helpful, and I think that we also need to consider how uh, training blocks are typically designed, and also the psychological approach that the athlete and or the coach might encourage throughout the course of that training block. So I see Zach nodding his head a good amount here, right? So like, um, you you know, theoretically, if you had the exact same training week, right, and you executed everything with the exact same degree of overshooting or lack thereof, you also executed it with the same exact psychological approach, it's not that you would eventually just run into a wall, right? Because theoretically you could just sustain that, but the difference is probably once you get to a degree of training stress where, you know, even if it was a single at RP8 throughout the entire training block and you didn't overshoot at all, but you got stronger, that absolute load is probably uh, an independent factor for fatigue as well, right? So I think perhaps shifting it from, hey, the fatigue monster starts as a little baby dragon, right, and then by the end it's throwing fire at you and it's taking up the whole room, right, as opposed to, okay, it's a product of how we've progressed throughout this training phase, and it's also a product of just being in that state for a sustained period of time, right, and perhaps needing a psychological break.
Yep. That puts the pieces together to me, Josh, when you were saying that. And one thing that's like starting to come to my mind now is I think this is also just a reflection on the way that I think athletes in general and maybe just humans in general handle things. Is like people don't start training and then, you know, zoom out of their training career and view everything as this one long bit of training. Like they don't look at it from that scale. People view things in these kind of like chapters, like a book, almost is like the way I'm thinking about it. If you're trying to lift the most weight as you possibly can, within that chapter, you're going to try to be adding weight. And there's just like from a mental standpoint, trying to achieve things you've never achieved before is demanding. And I think as you do that, that is going to come with those psychological expectancy effects and probably some degree of, I guess fatigue may not be the right word here, but that's, you know, the one that's coming to mind. Just along with that thought process of like, okay, I'm trying to get to this mini peak here, mini peak here, mini peak here, and that's going to come with some sort of depressed performance for multiple reasons, probably at the end of the day, to which, you know, is something we may need to address. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's crystal clear in my mind, but I just think the way that people approach training inherently takes a psychological approach that is demanding to
and to
make
be
progress.
and to
Yeah.
be clear, we're not saying that's bad.
No, no, no. Absolutely. I think it's
Right, right.
necessary.
I
Actually.
just want to be clear,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
We actually had some people in our group for individualized programming, or we had somebody ask like, "Hey, kind of came across this thought process that deloads aren't necessary,"
Right.
and I think it's a totally defensible stance to take. But once you start layering on some of those psychological considerations that Zach said of, hey, we don't really view this as like just this indefinite thing that we do. We kind of
Right.
say, oh man, I'm pretty juiced up about this block I got. I know, week one, I'm going to give myself a bit of a runway. Okay, last week of the block, boom, coach said to push a little bit harder. I'm going to push a little bit harder type thing. Once you start layering on that, then it's like, okay, we can actually maybe misrepresent this just sustained level of fatigue that might go up a little bit over time, but as just like this accumulating compounding effect, right? I think that's kind of the the difference in framing there. Drake, before I kick it over to you to add any comments, one thing I did want to follow up on that you mentioned, and also just make clear, kind of at least how this works in my mind. Um, we defined fatigue as a decrease in performance, right? But we're also saying that over the course of a block, you're in a state of fatigue. And those might seem to like butt heads with each other, but I actually those can coexist at the same time, right? And we know this because tapers work, right? So in other words, just you don't have to see your absolute strength level go down. Instead, you just have to know that, like, hey, in general, if I were to reduce training stress, my numbers would go up, if that makes sense. Zach, you seem puzzled there. Let me know
It,
if you
you
disagree.
you put it together at the end there. Basically, you're
Okay.
just saying that you could have a suppressed performance capacity, but it doesn't
But
necessarily
it
have
could
to be
still
negative.
objectively be going up.
Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
You could be like going from 80 to 90% of performance capacity, but still be less than 100.
Or your just 100% gets higher.
Right.
Drake, what do you think? Like,
Yeah.
I don't think I have
No, no,
an
no.
answer
Yeah.
to this. I
So
just wanted to, like, kind of, the listener might be thinking, like, you're saying you're under fatigue during the block, but you also define it as a decrease in performance. So just kind of like squaring that circle.
right. So relative to like your peak physical capacity, whatever that is, right? Like in theory, if we think of tapering into a powerlifting meet or powerlifting competition, the goal, like what we're trying to achieve there in an ideal world, probably utopian in some aspects, where it's like we align everything perfectly, right? Cognitive state is on point, we're dialed in physiologically, everything, like the stars have aligned. We go in there and what we're capable of doing on the platform is fully expressed, right? So that would be in theory like your 100%, right? But throughout a block, that may not you may not be at that ideal state from performance standpoint, and there could be other factors that are at play, which could bump you down from that 100% game day state. But that doesn't mean that you're going to see E1 or M trends go down. Like fatigue does not necessarily directly relate to those negative trends. It's more of just like a rolling state. Like no one's ever going to be working in a state that is absent from fatigue, right? Like on a day-to-day basis, everyone deals with things, right? Everyone deals with stressors. We combat those and we get acclimated to those. It's more so like when they're abnormal, right? So when those fatigue inputs, or I like to call them training and non-training stressors, are abnormally high, that could significantly diminish our capacity to perform at a high level. Therefore, that's when we could see that decrease in performance. And you could almost frame it as like an abnormal state of fatigue, right? Like it's abnormally high relative to whatever your baseline is. So it's not to say that like you're going to be like, if you experience fatigue, you're going to see decreased performance the following day. It's more so if that fatigue is abnormal from what you're accustomed to, then that's when you may see some negative things. That's not always the case. It's usually manifesting when it's like 2 to 3 weeks of abnormally high fatigue. So that could be your training stress gets increased acutely to a large degree, like your volume spikes up by like 30, 40%, and you're not ready for it. You get smacked and you get some of those peripheral factors that come into play. And you also get an increased workload at work, and family stress maybe picks up. Your sleep is bad. That's chronic for 2 to 3 weeks. That could be abnormal fatigue. You would expect to see some performance decrements there. So that's sort of like how I like to conceptualize it. It's not so much that when fatigue is not present, then we're just cruising and things are going well. You're always going to be dealing with some. Like even if you didn't train, you would have some. But when those things are abnormal, then you may see some slight things. Just make sure they're not out of the realm of what things you can tolerate or what you can handle, right?
Yeah, I think there's a ton there, that we could go down a ton of different rabbit holes right now. So we'll save that for another podcast episode. Like, for example, I think the relative fatigue is another concept you could dive into, right? So, like, for example, if I take someone through a ramp up phase in a training block where we're, increasing sets, increasing RPE throughout the whatever 2 or 3 week period, they might feel the most fatigued kind of at the end of that ramp up period. But once that relative fatigue, if you will, kind of sets in, right, and they become accustomed to the training stress, they might actually see a decrease. So, like, there's a ton of different rabbit holes we could go down. But I just kind of wanted to really make the point that fatigue and performance increments aren't mutually exclusive, right? They can happen at the same time. And this is probably where the textbook kind of standard fitness fatigue model has some application. Um, Unless either of you guys has any comments you want to add on that, we can move on to the next section of monitoring fatigue.
Yeah, just last thing here, just so everyone knows, like there's a lot related to fatigue that we just don't know, right? Like in order to quantify the central fatigue mechanisms, like that's hard. That's hard, man. Especially the cognitive and social things, like trying to measure those in a setting and how they potentially impact an athlete chronically is a challenge. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well.
That
Like we don't know exactly how to do this stuff.
yeah,
A lot of it is pulling from anecdote and things like that.
and I think the other thing too to mention is obviously that they're not in these nice discrete categories that we've kind of talked about them in either. Like there's absolutely feedback loops between one another. Like a classic example is like in a state of like super excessive muscle damage, which is technically not technically, but generally thought of as a peripheral thing because that's like a physiological change, like you mentioned, Drake, that can have inputs to a decreased central drive to that muscle. So it's like these things aren't as neat in their boxes like as we um, may help us to conceptualize. Like you said, Jake, there's just a ton we don't know. And I think one of the things, like you said, Josh, that I think is super interesting from a anecdote versus evidence perspective is like anybody that's lifted weights for a long time knows that you can't be absent of fatigue or however we measure it currently with just training with super heavy loads. Like you're wrecked after that. But in the way that we currently investigate it, that seems to be a considerably less fatiguing way to train. So I think, like I said, there's a lot to learn here. Just reiterating some of the things Drake said in terms of uncertainty, just spitballing here. But let's head to the next section and wrap this bad boy up.
Cool. So we touched on a good amount of this, but Drake, I'll kick it over to you to see if you have anything to add about like whether we can monitor fatigue. Um, yeah, we kind of talked about like that red, yellow, green stoplight system, if you will, for different fatigue categories, if you will. But yeah, I'll kick it over to you and see if you have anything to add on that front that we haven't covered yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So we covered a number of the different things that I want to go over here, but to talk about like how you may go about monitoring this, the red, yellow, green sort of stoplight system that we employ allows us to track some of the factors or some of the big check boxes that may or may not relate to that fatigue occurring. So the way that we do this in practice is on one hand, we like to obviously track the training related stressors. So these would be like what we prescribe to an athlete, their volume, what RPEs they're working at, things like that. So we can track what we have the athlete do, and then we can also track how the athlete responds to what we have them do. And those would be the more like non-training stressors. So this is things related to like how is their sleep quality? What is their desire to train like? So like a motivational factor. Um, how is their upper and lower body muscle soreness? How do they perceive those things? We can track these metrics and then determine whether or not they're abnormally poor or in line with what they're like Josh was kind of talking about, their like baseline or relative state of fatigue, what they can tolerate, what they're accustomed to. So the way that we do this is, we use like a weekly monitoring system. Like I said earlier in the pod, you can do this on a day-to-day basis, but what we'll do is we'll collect this data on a week-to-week basis, and then we'll use a standard deviation system, which more or less what this does is it takes, for example, desire to train. We have like 6 data points for that, and the athlete typically responds with a 5 out of 10. So 5 is like, I have a super normal desire to train, let's say, for them. That 5 is unique to them. And then we can look, okay, what is one standard deviation above or below that 5 rating? So for conversation purposes, maybe that +1 is a 6 and that -1 is a 4. Now let's say week 7, because we have 6 data points, they rate it as, in this example, let's say a 2. It's abnormally low, okay, if 10 is ideal. That would trigger us and send a red flag where it's like something may not be totally right here. They're not super amped to go in relative to what their normal state is. And then if that repeats for 2 to 3 weeks, then we can sort of see, okay, this is chronic. It's not just a 1 week thing. Maybe something's really going on and I should talk to them about that. So that's one way you can sort of track with all of these different metrics. Again, desire to train, sleep quality, life stress, muscle soreness perceptions, things like that. You can look at what their baseline running value is for that Likert scale, and then see whether or not they rate it abnormally high or abnormally poor, and then make some judgment calls as to whether or not you should spark a conversation about those things.
Yeah, I think the relative aspect of it is huge because some people will say they're like 10 out of 10 sore every single week no matter what, but it's like they're not like, I don't want to say they're not actually 10 out of 10 to invalidate, but you get my drift that it doesn't, the objective number doesn't matter. The relative change from their normal state matters. That's really all I have to add there.
Yeah, I don't have much to add either. I think it's a really cool way that you've kind of captured that kind of thought process and the way that we do things. So yeah, man, it's cool, and I enjoy using it.
Right on, guys. Yeah, so before we sort of like transition into the last section here, yeah, I like to sort of conceptualize like what we have the athlete do and how they respond in one bucket, right? We kind of talked about it's hard to dichotomize things and break them up into these two categories. In all reality, you're going to be working with those different sources of stress potentially all the time, and they intermingle a lot with one another. So I just wanted to add that there at the end.
Cool, man. So last part of this, and I think we've talked about this a good amount, is just practical application. So we talked about coach athlete conversations are your best tool. We kind of mentioned this at the beginning, right? Like it's never gonna be when working with someone one on one, it's never gonna be algorithmic in the sense that X leads to Y, right? This is to inform a discussion. And then we also talked about, potentially when you might choose to take further action, right? Like for example, I know that I have athletes that they'll kind of know when something is going to be off in their monitoring questions, but they'll give me a heads up because there's a spot like at the bottom to like free response, if you will, like any additional notes. They'll be like, sleep was off this week, pretty crazy week at work, we'll be good to go tomorrow. Like some people, we're just kind of like firing on all cylinders in that front. And Drake, I think me and you are the same way, especially since you know exactly how the system was designed. But anyway, with that out of the way, I'll kind of kick it over to you, Drake, and see if you have anything to add here before we wrap up about practical application of this stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty set. I think we can move on to like how we actually would recommend using this stuff in practice and things like that.
Cool. Yeah, man. You can just run with that. Whatever things you
Right
have
on.
to add.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, to build on that example, Josh, kind of like how we operate a little bit, right? Coach athlete relationship here. It's like if things are off, like on a 1 week basis, right? Like things come up and they get a little crazy, and maybe you can't necessarily get into the gym to hit all 5 sessions or whatnot. If that occurs, like that's a one-off thing, right? That's an acute thing, and just roll with it, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, things were crazy 1 week, I got to cut like 3 squat sets in week 2 and adjust right away. So I really want to highlight that you should focus on them being more like chronic negative affective states, right? So it's like if things are really off at work and things are hectic for 2 or 3 weeks, then it's like, okay, maybe we need to accommodate that and make some adjustments there just to better fit your schedule, and that may leave you feeling a little less stressed out. Like, oh, I'm not like worried about missing sessions all the time, things like that. That could be beneficial. So just in practice, again, focusing on like prolonged changes to any of these variables or anything that arises in conversation is really key. And don't get too caught up in like, well, 1 week soreness was abnormally high, I got to go in and like, you know, adjust the upper body training load or whatnot right away. Make sure that that is sort of like a sustained thing, and touch base with the athlete first before you go about, potentially adjusting training, things like that.
One thing this has made me think about, and I'd be curious to get you guys' thoughts on. I think this conversation has um, made it more clear to me how important it is to have conversations around the psychological approach to a given protocol. I think it just can't be overstated how, you write a given protocol on the paper. Let's just say a set of 5 and an RP8. You can approach that set in so many different ways that probably has downstream effects into all the things we've discussed today. That I think, I've programmed like arousal level before, like in the protocols themselves, a few times, and I think that might be something I start thinking about doing a bit more, just because I think that's such a variable that can influence all these other things. Like if you're getting super hyped up for a couple sets, that's going to have downstream effects in the way you handle your training sessions later in the week. It also is going to impact the predictability of performance trends if that's something you're not standardizing week to week as well. So I just think that's something from a really tangible perspective for pretty much anybody. When you're programming or when you're coaching someone, I think this is something you can't really quantify super well, and it's something that just comes through that coach athlete relationship. I think you need to be clear into your expectations for how that session is going to be approached psychologically. And I think some of the language that's a little bit more popular now around like primary session, secondary session, like I think that has some element of that. But I think, easy examples like a power lifter, they see a single on their training program, regardless of the RP, that is approached differently than a submaximal top set of 4 or 5. Like it just is. If you've coached enough people, I think that's going to be a pretty common experience for somebody that cares about their 1RM. So that's just something I'm becoming more and more cognizant of, is that is an additional variable. And as you kind of talked about, Drake, all these psychological and social factors that we can't really quantify or grasp really neatly in this kind of fatigue model, how fatigue accumulates, how we can predict it over the course of a training block or training cycle. I think that's something that probably isn't talked about enough in how we psychologically approach a lot of the parts of our training program. I think accessory work's another easy example. Like oftentimes people just like throw that on the end of a training program, and it's taken that way by the athlete as well. Like if you see you got your squat work, you got your bench work, then you just have exercise kind of slapped on at the end. Um, it can be approached that way, and that might impact the training stimulus and the fatigue imparted from that, as opposed to maybe you program the exact same training program, the exact same training session for somebody that's hypertrophy focused. That might result in a completely different trend of performance throughout that training week, um, even if all their factors are held in a similar state. So I just think that's something that's really been crystallized from this conversation that I think is something we can probably start to approach a bit differently if we really, really, really think about that deeply.
I have nothing to add. I was basically going to say the same thing. Like I will typically ask that like people always log their sets using RPE based solely on reps in reserve. But I will still, but I'll give a wide range if I know somebody's under like a wide variation on a day to day or week to week basis in terms of outside of gym stressors. So I've programmed as wide of ranges as like single at 4 to 8.5. So it's like basically I kind of want you to like shoot for like a single at 6 to 7 type thing, but you're almost using like a Borg RPE in there as well. So you're almost thinking like just general exertion, like how hard is it for me to get up and do this, and then you log it in terms of reps in reserve. So it's like okay, like that. Yes, Borg RP that felt like an RP7, but I know I actually had 6 in the tank, so I'm going to log that as a single at 4. But point being is like I actually have been moving a lot more towards that with high outside of gym stressors, is just giving a little bit more auto regulation on that front to accommodate that. Um, but yeah, I've basically nothing to add. Like that's why with individualized programming, webinar number 2 is on psychological periodization, and then I want to say webinar 6 is on top set load constraints, because that can also be a way to kind of control your psychological arousal to some degree, right? If that top set protocol is a little bit more constrained, it's going to kind of almost constrain their approach to it in some way and kind of limit their top end strategically in order to make performance more predictable. So this is all stuff that I totally agree with. Drake, kick it over to you, dude.
Yeah, man. I mean, I don't. You guys did an excellent job of kind of wrapping it up there and applying it to like how we would program for people that have really high non-training related stress going on. So, yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add onto that. I think we covered a ton of stuff there, guys.
All right, sounds good. We'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you for tuning in to episode 24. We will be reaching out to some people on the wait list in terms of getting as Drake kind of starts taking on one-on-one clients under data driven strength. But if you are interested in applying for one-on-one coaching, go ahead and check out the description of this wherever you're listening or watching, um, and you'll find more information there. Also, if you want to see the product of a lot of Drake's hard work with individualized programming, we'll leave a link down there as well to sign up. And yeah, if you have a second and you enjoyed this podcast and you're willing to leave us a rating, 5-star rating on iTunes or wherever else you can leave ratings, that would be much appreciated. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.